"Sir, my mommy's crying in the bathroom." The words cut through the hum of the train station like a blade through silk, stopping Jamie mid-sentence in a phone call worth more than most people earned in a year. He turned to find a small girl with blonde curls plastered to her forehead by rain, clutching a stuffed rabbit with ears that drooped like wilted flowers. Her eyes held that particular shade of worry that children shouldn't know existed, the kind that comes from watching adults fall apart. Jamie's first instinct was to keep walking because other people's problems didn't concern men who built empires in shadows. But something in the child's face held him captive. She couldn't have been more than 6, wearing a coat that had seen better seasons, and shoes that squelched with each anxious shift of weight. The station swirled around them with the usual chaos of delayed departures and impatient travelers. But this small figure stood perfectly still, like she'd learned early that staying quiet made you invisible. The women's restroom door stood 20 feet away, painted institutional beige and marked with a sign that hung slightly crooked. Through the gap at the bottom, Jamie could see the shadow of feet that hadn't moved in several minutes, positioned in a stall, like someone trying to disappear into porcelain and tile. The girl's statement hadn't been a request for help exactly, more like an observation delivered to the universe in hopes someone might know what to do with it. "How long has she been in there?" His voice came out rougher than intended, the tone he used in boardrooms where men made decisions that affected entire distribution networks. The girl's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't step back, which showed either bravery or a complete lack of understanding about who deserved fear. She held up fingers in a configuration that might have meant 15 minutes or 50, depending on a 6-year-old's grasp of time. Rain drummed against the station's high windows, creating percussion that matched the anxiety radiating from this small person who'd chosen a stranger as her last resort. Jamie's world operated on calculations of risk versus reward, on knowing when to push and when to walk away from situations that could compromise carefully constructed legitimacy. Standing in a train station concerning himself with a crying woman and her daughter fell into the category of complications his security team would classify as unnecessary exposure. The girl's expectant expression suggested she'd identified him as someone who fixed things, an assessment that was simultaneously accurate and dangerously naive. The stuffed rabbit's button eyes seemed to judge him for the hesitation. The station's architecture created natural corridors of movement, where thousands passed daily without truly seeing each other, anonymous in their individual urgencies. Coffee shops and ticket counters formed a commercial perimeter around the waiting area, where molded plastic seats bolted to the floor offered minimal comfort. Announcements echoed from speakers that distorted every third word, creating a constant backdrop of almost information. The bathroom where the girl's mother hid became the epicenter of a small crisis playing out beneath everyone's notice. Jamie's expensive shoes made no sound on the polished floor as he moved closer. Through the gap under the door, he could now hear what the child must have been listening to, for however long she'd been standing guard. Quiet crying, the kind that came from someone trying desperately not to make noise, broken occasionally by hitched breathing that suggested the person had been at it a while. The girl shifted beside him, small fingers now twisted in the hem of her wet coat. She'd stopped looking at Jamie and fixed her gaze on the bathroom door like force of will might change what was happening behind it. Her shoes left small puddles on the tile that caught fluorescent light in rippling patterns. "My name is Bethany," she offered suddenly, the introduction formal in a way that suggested someone had taught her manners mattered even in disasters. "We came for Mommy's interview, but it went wrong somehow, and now we can't go home because the tickets cost money we don't have anymore." The information spilled out in that unfiltered way children delivered truths that adults learned to wrap in euphemism. She hugged the rabbit tighter, its damp fur leaving a wet patch on her coat. The simplicity of her explanation contained layers of catastrophe that Jamie's mind automatically calculated into scenarios of missed rent and empty refrigerators. His phone buzzed twice in his pocket, messages from people whose patience had limits that didn't account for bathroom emergencies in train stations. The legitimate side of his business empire required constant attention, careful separation from activities that happened in warehouses after dark. The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of running water and paper towels being pulled from a dispenser in aggressive quantities. Someone was composing themselves, gathering pieces back together before facing the world that waited outside a bathroom stall. Jamie stepped back from the door, some instinct suggesting the woman inside wouldn't appreciate an audience for her emergence. Bethany remained rooted in place, small sentinel refusing to abandon her post. The station's crowds flowed around them like water around stones. A man in a business suit rushed past carrying 3 shopping bags and the stress of someone running late. Two teenagers laughed at something on a phone screen, their joy creating sharp contrast to the tension concentrated near the bathroom door. The normalcy of everyone else's day made this small crisis feel both insignificant and monumentally important, depending on which perspective mattered more. When the door finally opened, the woman who stepped out bore little resemblance to whatever image Jamie had constructed from crying sounds and a child's worried face. She was young, blonde hair pulled back in a bun that had started neat hours ago, but now listed to one side. Her eyes were red, but her spine was straight, jaw set in a line that spoke of determination, fighting a losing battle with reality. She took in Jamie's presence with a flicker of confusion, before her gaze dropped to Bethany, and something in her expression cracked just slightly before resetting to careful blankness. Her clothes were clean but worn, professional in a way that spoke of careful preservation rather than regular replacement. A purse hung from her shoulder, the leather cracked at the corners from years of use. She touched Bethany's head with a tenderness that made something uncomfortable shift in Jamie's chest. "Baby, I asked you to wait by the chairs." Her voice carried the hoarse quality of recent tears, but the tone was gentle, corrective without anger. She didn't acknowledge Jamie directly, which suggested either she assumed Bethany had approached him or was too far into survival mode to care about social niceties. The woman's hands trembled slightly as she smoothed Bethany's wet curls, a gesture that seemed more about grounding herself than fixing the child's appearance. He seemed like someone who helps people. Bethany's logic was sound, if dangerously optimistic about human nature. The woman's eyes finally met Jamie's properly, and in that moment he watched her make rapid calculations about what his expensive suit and confident stance meant for her situation. She saw wealth, possibly opportunity, probably danger of a different kind than the immediate crisis she was navigating. Her chin lifted in a defensive gesture that protected dignity, even when circumstances had stripped away almost everything else. "I apologize for my daughter bothering you." The words came out formal, a script for maintaining propriety when the world was actively falling apart. She reached for Bethany's hand with clear intention to remove them both from this embarrassing tableau. Jamie noticed the absence of a wedding ring, the calluses on her palms that suggested work that wasn't behind a desk. Her eyes held exhaustion that went deeper than one bad day, the kind that accumulated from months of fighting battles that never quite ended. She wasn't a bother. Jamie's response came automatically, though he was already calculating what helping might look like and why he was even considering it. The woman's jaw tightened at his tone, some instinct correctly identifying the kind of man who could make things happen with a phone call, but whose help always came with invisible price tags. She was preparing to refuse whatever he might offer, pride maintaining structure when everything else threatened collapse. Bethany looked between them with the confusion of someone too young to understand the complicated dance of adult pride and desperation. The waiting area held the kind of furniture designed to be uncomfortable enough that people didn't linger longer than necessary. Molded plastic and institutional gray that squeaked against damp clothing. Terry guided Bethany toward an empty section near the ticket counter, her movements careful like someone conserving energy for a marathon that kept extending its distance. Jamie followed at a distance that could be interpreted as coincidental rather than deliberate, though nothing he did happened by accident. The woman's shoulders remained rigid with awareness of his presence behind them. Bethany climbed onto a seat that made her legs swing freely, the stuffed rabbit positioned carefully in her lap. Her mother remained standing, one hand on the back of the child's chair, the other clutching her purse like it contained something more valuable than whatever was actually inside. The ticket counter sat 30 feet away, destination boards above it displaying departure times that might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the good they did. Terry's eyes tracked the information with the expression of someone watching ships sail away from a shore they couldn't reach. "We should have enough for the bus if we wait until tomorrow," Terry said quietly to Bethany, the statement clearly meant to reassure the child but landing hollow in the space between them. "We can stay here tonight, and in the morning we'll get home and everything will be fine." The lie was gentle, constructed from a mother's desperation to shield her daughter from the full weight of their situation. Bethany nodded, but her grip on the rabbit suggested she understood more than the words were designed to reveal. Jamie maintained his position near a coffee kiosk, close enough to observe but far enough to avoid crowding them. His phone continued its persistent buzzing with messages from associates who expected immediate responses to questions about shipping schedules and border crossing timing. The legitimate import business he'd built as cover for less legal activities demanded constant attention, a carefully constructed facade that required as much work as the empire it concealed. He typed responses with one hand, while watching Terry open her purse with movements that looked like stealing oneself before checking a wound. The contents of her wallet told a story more clearly than any explanation could. She pulled out a handful of change, counting coins with the focus of someone hoping mathematics might suddenly work differently. Her lips moved in silent calculation, fingers sorting quarters from dimes with the precision of someone accustomed to making every cent matter. When she finished counting, her hand closed around the money, and her eyes shut for just a moment, a brief surrender to disappointment before forcing them open again. Bethany had started humming something tuneless, the way children filled silence when adults forgot to maintain the comforting illusion that everything was under control. Her feet kicked in rhythm with the sound, shoes still damp from the rain that had soaked them before they'd even entered the station. Terry's hand moved to still the motion automatically, then withdrew as if remembering this wasn't the moment to correct harmless fidgeting. The exhaustion in her face had layers, the immediate crisis sitting atop deeper weariness that suggested this was just the latest in a long series of impossible situations. Jamie approached with 2 cups of coffee and a hot chocolate, the transaction at the kiosk having taken less than a minute, but requiring navigation of Terry's certain refusal of charity. He set them on the chair beside Bethany without preamble, the gesture casual enough to deny it was significant. Terry's eyes narrowed at the cups, her body language shifting from defeated to defensive in the space of a heartbeat. Her mouth opened to refuse before she'd even processed what was being offered, pride triggering faster than gratitude could form. "I didn't order these." Her tone made it a statement of fact, rather than a question. Clarity that this wasn't confusion, but rejection. She didn't reach for the coffee, even though her hand had unconsciously moved toward it before stopping. Bethany looked at the hot chocolate with longing that she tried to hide by focusing intensely on her rabbit's drooping ears. The steam rising from the cups created small clouds in the air-conditioned space, visual reminder of warmth being offered and refused. They made extras by mistake. Jamie's lie was smooth, delivered with the confidence of someone accustomed to making people believe convenient fictions. The kiosk worker asked if I'd take them rather than waste them. "I don't drink chocolate." He directed the last part at Bethany, who glanced at her mother with a question in her eyes. Terry's jaw worked like she was chewing on words too sharp to spit out in front of her daughter. The silence stretched uncomfortable, while Terry calculated how accepting drinks translated to accepting obligation. Her pride had architecture, weight-bearing walls that held up her sense of self when circumstances stripped away everything else. But Bethany's small hand had already reached for the hot chocolate, and Terry's face showed the exact moment she decided her daughter's immediate comfort outweighed her own need to refuse charity. Her shoulders dropped incrementally, surrender masquerading as acceptance. "Thank you." The words came out tight, extracted rather than offered freely. She took one of the coffees but didn't drink it, just held the cup like its warmth was the actual gift, rather than the contents. Jamie noticed her hands wrapped around the paper cup with an intensity that suggested she was using the heat to remind herself she could still feel something other than panic. Bethany sipped her chocolate, leaving a foam mustache that made her look even younger than 6. The ticket counter closed its second window, reducing service with the efficient indifference of an organization operating on schedules that didn't account for human emergency. The line that had been 6 people deep minutes ago dwindled to 3. Travelers purchasing their escape from this transitional space to wherever they had the resources to go. Terry watched the transactions with an expression that transformed longing into something harder, acceptance that some doors closed simply because you stood on the wrong side of them. "The interview didn't go badly," Terry said suddenly, the statement directed at no one in particular or perhaps at herself. "I answered everything correctly. My references were solid. My experience matched what they needed." She paused, taking a breath that shook slightly. They just decided to go with someone internal, saved them relocation costs. The explanation came out flat, recitation of facts that added up to doors closing despite doing everything right. Bethany had chocolate on her chin now, focused entirely on the sweetness in her cup, with the beautiful singularity of childhood attention. Terry pulled a napkin from her purse and wiped the child's face with automatic gentleness, the gesture so practiced it happened without conscious thought. Jamie recognized the interview story for what it was. Not an invitation for sympathy, but a defense against the assumption that failure resulted from inadequacy rather than circumstances. She was establishing she'd done everything right, that poverty wasn't a moral failure, but a mathematical problem without solution. What kind of work? Jamie's question was strategic, opening the conversation to possibilities without making offers that would trigger her defensive pride. He already knew the answer would reveal education and skills, that this wasn't a woman who lacked capability, but one whom fortune had simply stopped favoring. Terry's eyes met his with that calculating expression again, weighing whether engaging meant inviting help she'd have to refuse. Executive administration, she answered finally, the title carrying weight of a career that existed in past tense. I managed schedules, communications, logistics for a VP-level executive before the company downsized. 6 years of experience, proficiency in 3 software systems, organizational skills that kept a department running smoothly. The recitation was professional, practiced from job applications and interviews that had led nowhere. Her voice carried no bitterness, just tired factuality about skills that should have mattered, but somehow didn't translate to security. Jamie processed the information through the lens of his legitimate business operations. Import companies required complex coordination, documentation that satisfied customs officials, scheduling that accounted for international shipping variables. His current assistant handled basic tasks adequately, but lacked sophistication for expansion he'd been planning. The position Terry described matched needs he'd been ignoring because finding trustworthy people who didn't ask questions about certain shipments proved challenging. I run an import business. His statement was careful, neither offer nor simple conversation. Legitimate operations, mostly textiles and manufactured goods from overseas suppliers. The administrative work is substantial. He let the information hang between them. Not quite a job offer, but clearly more than idle chat. Terry's expression shifted through several emotions too quickly to catalog, landing somewhere between hope and suspicion with a heavy dose of disbelief. Terry's coffee had gone cold in her hands, forgotten while her mind worked through calculations that showed clearly on her face. She set the cup down with deliberate care, movements controlled like someone handling something fragile that might shatter with rough treatment. Bethany had finished her hot chocolate and returned to humming, oblivious to the negotiation happening in silence above her head. The station's ambient noise created a bubble of privacy around them, conversations and announcements blending into white noise that made intimate discussion possible in public space. I appreciate the conversation, Terry began, her tone suggesting this was preamble to polite refusal. But I live 2 states away, and I don't have resources for relocation or deposits on new housing. She delivered the facts without emotion, barriers that existed regardless of opportunity presented. Her eyes held that exhausted resignation of someone who'd learned that hope deferred wasn't just disappointment, but active cruelty. She reached for her purse like preparing to end this interlude and returned to the impossible situation of making nothing stretch to cover everything. Jamie had anticipated the objection, because logistics always mattered more than good intentions. The position includes relocation assistance and 60 days of temporary housing while you establish yourself. The offer emerged fully formed, details clicking into place with the efficiency that made him successful in both his legitimate and shadow enterprises. He watched Terry's face carefully, noting the way her breath caught and held, like his words were objects that might dissolve if she exhaled too forcefully. Why? The single word contained volumes of skepticism, earned through experience with offers that came with hooks hidden in fine print. Her eyes narrowed with the intelligence that had made her valuable to a VP-level executive, the kind of sharp assessment that saw through performance to motivation underneath. She was right to be suspicious because men like Jamie didn't hand out opportunities to strangers in train stations without reason, and she knew it even if she couldn't articulate what those reasons might be. Jamie considered his answer carefully, because truth had more variations than most people acknowledged. He could say he needed competent help, which was accurate. He could claim civic responsibility, which would be a lie. He could admit that watching her count change with desperate precision had triggered something in him that didn't fit comfortably with his usual operational detachment, which was true but inadequate. Instead, he pulled a business card from his wallet and set it beside her cold coffee. Because qualified people are difficult to find, and I watched you return a wallet to Lost and Found 3 days ago instead of keeping the $200 inside. The statement landed between them with weight of surveillance admitted casually. Terry's face went through several expressions, landing on shocked understanding. She'd been observed, her moment of moral choice witnessed and apparently judged worthy of reward. The revelation should have felt invasive, but somehow landed differently, like being seen rather than watched. You were here 3 days ago. She spoke slowly, assembling timeline that suddenly had new significance. The interview that failed had been the same day she'd found the wallet, same station where desperation and integrity had gone to war inside her. Jamie's presence during that private battle meant her current crisis was unfolding in front of the same witness who'd seen her choose difficulty over compromise. The coincidence seemed too neat, which meant it probably wasn't coincidence at all. I maintain interest in people who make difficult choices correctly. Jamie's explanation offered no apology for observation or intervention. His world ran on information, on knowing who could be trusted when pressure mounted and easy options presented themselves. Terry's decision to return money she desperately needed had revealed character that couldn't be faked on resumes or demonstrated in interviews. The test had been unintentional, but the results were conclusive. Bethany tugged on her mother's sleeve, pulling attention down to her level. "Does this mean we can go home tomorrow?" Her question held a child's ability to cut through complexity to the only detail that actually mattered to her small world. Terry's hand moved to smooth her daughter's hair, buying time while her mind worked through implications of accepting help from a man who admittedly conducted surveillance on strangers in train stations. "It means Mommy needs to think about some things," Terry answered carefully, giving herself space to process without disappointing her daughter with immediate rejection. She picked up the business card, turning it over like hidden information might be printed on the back. Russo Import Company was embossed in simple lettering, an address in the city's business district, a phone number. Nothing about it screamed danger, but nothing about it explained why its owner had been watching her either. Jamie recognized the hesitation for what it was, not rejection, but evaluation. She was smart enough to know that accepting would create obligation she couldn't define yet, and cautious enough to suspect that undefined obligation was exactly how people got trapped in situations they couldn't escape. Her fingers traced the raised lettering on the card, while her eyes stayed fixed on his face, searching for tells that might reveal what this offer would actually cost. "The position is real," he said, addressing the suspicion he could see forming. "The work is legitimate administrative coordination, nothing that would compromise you legally or morally. You'd have your own apartment, separate from any obligation to me personally." The clarification was necessary, because he could see her mind going to places where powerful men helped desperate women, with expectations that had nothing to do with filing systems. Her shoulders relaxed incrementally at the boundaries he drew. "I'd need references from your previous employer, standard background check, 2-week trial period to ensure the position fits both our needs." Jamie continued building structure around the offer, transforming it from charity into transaction with clear parameters. Business terms created safety that generosity couldn't, rules that protected both parties from the messy complications of gratitude and obligation. Terry's expression shifted again, calculation replacing wariness as she processed the proposal through professional rather than desperate lens. The ticket counter's final window closed, metal grate sliding down with finality that declared this space closed for business until morning. Terry's eyes tracked the movement, visible reminder that her current options were narrowing toward sleeping in plastic chairs, while Bethany asked innocent questions about whether people lived in train stations. The choice Jamie offered wasn't between good and bad, but between uncertain risk and certain impossibility. "I'd want the offer in writing," Terry said finally, her voice steadier than it had been since emerging from the bathroom. "Employment contract, housing details, salary expectations, all of it documented before I uproot my daughter." The requirements were reasonable, protective without being paranoid. She was negotiating now rather than refusing, which meant some part of her had decided to hope despite experience teaching her that hope was usually premature. Jamie pulled out his phone, fingers moving across the screen with practiced efficiency. "I'll have my attorney draft everything tonight and email it within 3 hours. You can review it, consult with anyone you want, take 48 hours to decide." He was giving her control, transforming his offer from something done to her into a choice she could make with eyes open. The distinction mattered more than the actual opportunity. Terry nodded slowly, then seemed to remember something. "I don't have email access until I get home." The admission came reluctantly, revealing another layer of how thoroughly circumstances had stripped away conveniences others took for granted. Her phone was probably a basic model without data plan, budget cut to essentials that didn't include internet connectivity. Jamie noticed she didn't apologize for the limitation, just stated it as fact requiring accommodation. "Write down your address. I'll have the documents couriered to you by tomorrow afternoon." Jamie handed her his phone, Notes app open for her information. She hesitated only briefly before typing, the action somehow momentous despite its simplicity. By giving him her address, She was allowing this connection to extend beyond the anonymous space of the train station into her actual life. The gesture required trust she had no rational basis for extending. Bethany had fallen asleep against her mother's side, the stuffed rabbit clutched loosely in her arms. Her face had gone soft with the absolute relaxation only children achieved, trust that adults would handle the complications while she rested. Terry's hand moved unconsciously to cup her daughter's head, protective gesture that happened without thought. When she looked up at Jamie, something in her expression had shifted from defensive suspicion to cautious possibility, like someone considering that maybe the universe wasn't entirely composed of closed doors. The courier arrived at Terry's apartment building on a Tuesday afternoon, a professional in a pressed uniform carrying an envelope that felt heavier than paper should. She signed for it with hands that trembled slightly, the action making real what had felt dreamlike in the fluorescent unreality of the train station. Bethany pressed against her side, trying to see what the important-looking package contained. The courier drove away in a vehicle too clean for their neighborhood, leaving Terry standing in a hallway that smelled of old cooking and deferred maintenance. Inside the envelope were documents formatted with the precision of expensive legal counsel, each clause numbered and explained in language that managed to be both technical and clear. The employment contract offered a salary that was generous without being suspicious, benefits that included health insurance and retirement matching. Housing assistance came with specific addresses of 3 apartment options, all in neighborhoods Terry had researched online at the library and knew were safe, clean, places where Bethany could play outside without constant supervision. She read through everything twice, then a third time looking for the catch that experience insisted must exist somewhere in the carefully constructed paragraphs. Men with resources didn't help women with nothing unless they wanted something specific in return, and she'd learned to identify those transactions before they trapped her. But the contract was airtight in its professionalism, boundaries drawn clearly around work hours and responsibilities that had nothing to do with personal availability. The reference check authorization made her stomach clench, because her former employer had been sympathetic, but clear that budget cuts meant her position was eliminated, not her performance questioned. She'd left on good terms, but couldn't shake the fear that somehow that wouldn't translate into the recommendation that might determine whether Bethany slept in a real bed next month. Her pen hovered over the signature line, while she calculated risk versus continuing the exhausting mathematics of poverty. Bethany had spread her drawing supplies across the kitchen table, coloring with the intense focus she applied to anything that let her create. The crayons were worn to nubs, some colors missing entirely from a set that had been budget priced to begin with. She was drawing a house with flowers in front, a sun in the corner, 2 stick figures holding hands with a smaller figure between them. The image was achingly normal, a child's vision of stability that Terry hadn't been able to provide. "Is that our new house?" Terry asked, watching her daughter add yellow to the sun with careful strokes. Bethany nodded without looking up, adding a tree with a swing that showed optimism Terry couldn't afford to share completely. The drawing represented hope that came easily to children, but felt dangerous to adults who knew how quickly situations could collapse. Still, Terry picked up the pen and signed the documents before caution could override desperation. The phone call to Jamie's office connected her to an assistant whose voice carried the efficient warmth of someone trained to make strangers feel attended to without actual intimacy. She confirmed receipt of the signed contracts, mentioned that housing options would be available for viewing this weekend if Terry could make the trip. The assistant's tone suggested this was routine, just another hiring process rather than a life raft thrown to someone drowning in circumstances beyond control. Jamie had included train tickets in the envelope, round-trip passage for 2 with a departure time that gave Terry 3 days to pack a life that barely filled 4 suitcases. The gesture solved the immediate transportation problem while creating new anxiety about what came after these tickets, whether this rescue would prove temporary or transform into the stability she'd been chasing for 2 years. She held the tickets like they might dissolve if she acknowledged them too directly. Her landlord accepted notice with the indifference of someone accustomed to tenants who came and went, according to economic tides they couldn't control. The apartment had never been home exactly, just a space they occupied between better circumstances and worse possibilities. Packing revealed how little they actually owned, how much of life could be reduced to essentials when choice was removed from the equation. Bethany's toys fit in a single box, her clothes in a small suitcase that had belonged to Terry's mother. The train ride north happened in a blur of landscape that transformed from familiar to foreign as miles accumulated. Bethany pressed her face against the window, narrating observations about cows and barns and trees that all looked the same to Terry's anxious eyes. The tickets Jamie had sent were for seats with actual cushioning, not the hard benches of economy travel. Small comfort that somehow made the unreality of the situation more pronounced. The apartment options were in a building with security doors and mailboxes that locked, hallways that smelled like cleaning products instead of resignation. The superintendent showed them 3 units with the practiced efficiency of someone who conducted these tours daily, pointing out features like they were selling rather than simply presenting. Terry chose the smallest option, unable to justify taking more space than they needed, even when someone else was paying for it. "You start Monday," the assistant informed her during a brief meeting in an office with windows that overlooked the business district's morning rush. "The first 2 weeks will be orientation, learning our systems and processes. Mr. Russo handles certain aspects of the business personally and requires discretion regarding his schedule and contacts." The phrasing was careful, suggesting layers to the operation that weren't her concern, but existed nonetheless. The weekend before her start date, Terry unpacked their belongings into an apartment that felt surreal in its stability. The refrigerator hummed with efficient newness. The locks on the door actually required keys that worked smoothly. Bethany claimed the smaller bedroom with joy that made Terry's chest ache, hanging her few drawings on walls that would accept tape without landlords threatening security deposit deductions. Normal felt foreign after so long making do with precarious. Sunday night she couldn't sleep, lying in a bed that didn't squeak with every movement, and staring at a ceiling that didn't have water stains mapping previous tenants' disasters. The contract sat on her nightstand, proof that this wasn't imagination or desperate fantasy. She'd given her address to a man she didn't know, signed documents that bound her to employment she didn't fully understand, uprooted her daughter based on nothing more substantial than a returned wallet and a stranger's attention. But Bethany slept soundly in the next room for the first time in months, her breathing even and undisturbed by her mother's anxiety spiraling in the darkness. That peace was worth the risk, worth whatever complications might emerge from accepting help from someone whose eyes had assessed her with an intensity that suggested he saw more than the surface circumstances. Terry closed her eyes and tried to believe that sometimes strangers intervened without ulterior motives, that charity could exist without strings attached. The thought didn't quite convince her, but exhaustion eventually overrode suspicion and pulled her into sleep that came in fits and starts. Morning would bring the reality of whatever she'd actually agreed to, the reveal of what working for Jamie Russo truly entailed. For now, she existed in the space between desperation and possibility, hoping that this time the door she'd walked through didn't lock behind her. Her alarm went off at 6, jarring her from dreams that had been anxious jumbles of train stations and locked bathrooms and documents she couldn't read. She dressed in clothes she'd carefully preserved for interviews, professional armor that had stopped feeling protective after so many rejections. The mirror showed a woman who looked composed, if you didn't notice the tension in her jaw or the way her hands couldn't stay still. Bethany woke cheerful, excited about her new school that started the same day as Terry's job. The synchronicity felt planned, another detail that Jamie or his efficient assistant had arranged to remove obstacles before Terry could articulate them. The care in that planning should have been comforting, but instead felt like evidence of resources and attention that came from somewhere, cost something she hadn't calculated yet. The office building stood among others in the business district, its exterior unremarkable except for the subtle security measures Terry noticed, only because she was looking for them. Cameras positioned at angles that covered entrances without being obvious, a reception desk staffed by someone whose attention tracked everyone who entered with professional assessment disguised as courtesy. She gave her name and watched recognition register immediately, like she'd been expected, prepared for, briefed about. Jamie's assistant met her in the lobby, a woman in her 40s named Patricia, who managed to convey both warmth and boundaries in her handshake. "Mr. Russo is in meetings until 10, so I'll handle your orientation this morning." She led Terry to an elevator that required a key card for certain floors, explaining security protocols with the casual efficiency of someone who'd given this speech before. The building hummed with the activity of legitimate commerce, people conducting business that left paper trails and satisfied regulators. Her office was small but had a window, a desk with a computer that looked recent, rather than salvaged from previous generations of technology. Patricia handed her a badge with her photo already printed, benefits paperwork that had been partially completed with information from her contract. "You'll handle administrative coordination for 3 departments: logistics, customs compliance, and vendor relations. Mr. Russo oversees all 3, but needs someone who can manage the daily details that keep everything running smoothly." The work itself was exactly what Terry had done before, just scaled larger, and with international complications that domestic operations hadn't required. She spent the morning learning software systems that were intuitive enough she'd be proficient within days. Patricia introduced her to department heads who welcomed her with the cautious politeness of people uncertain whether she was temporary help or someone with the boss's ear. The distinction mattered in offices where proximity to power determined hierarchy as much as actual title did. Jamie appeared just before lunch, entering the administrative area with the quiet confidence of someone who owned not just the company, but the space itself. People's posture changed when he was present, becoming more focused, more careful with their words. He stopped at Terry's desk, his attention complete in a way that made her understand why people would follow his direction, without questioning whether they should. Settling in. The question was casual, but his eyes assessed her for signs of regret or discomfort. Patricia's been thorough. Terry kept her response professional, not quite warm but not defensive either. She was aware of eyes watching this interaction, colleagues calculating what her connection to Jamie might mean for office dynamics. He seemed to notice the attention too, nodding once before moving to his own office without prolonging the moment. The brevity felt intentional, establishing distance that would let her build credibility, separate from however she'd been hired. Lunch was at her desk because she didn't know the social dynamics yet, didn't want to navigate cafeteria politics on her first day. She'd packed a sandwich in the morning, budget habits persisting even though her salary meant she could afford the cafe downstairs. Patricia stopped by with coffee, sitting on the edge of Terry's desk with the familiarity of someone establishing mentorship. "He doesn't usually take such personal interest in hiring," she said carefully, not quite asking but clearly curious. "I was in the right place when he needed someone." Terry's response was truthful enough without inviting more questions. She appreciated that Patricia let it rest there, accepting the non-explanation with the wisdom of someone who'd worked for Jamie long enough to know some things weren't her business. The conversation shifted to safer topics. Which departments had the most urgent needs, who could be trusted to provide accurate information, versus who required verification of everything they claimed. The afternoon brought her first direct interaction with Jamie's schedule, a request that she coordinate a meeting between 3 vendors whose time zones made simultaneous availability challenging. She worked through the puzzle methodically, finding a window that minimized inconvenience for everyone involved. When she sent the final calendar invitations, Jamie appeared at her desk again, this time with a document that needed formatting for a presentation. "Can you have this ready by 4? The task was simple, but the deadline was tight, requiring focus that didn't allow for second-guessing or perfectionist revision. Terry formatted the document with the efficiency of someone who'd spent years making executives look prepared for meetings they'd barely reviewed materials for. She delivered it at 3:45, the extra 15 minutes a buffer that proved unnecessary but felt professional. Jamie scanned through it quickly, nodded approval, then surprised her by asking if Bethany had settled into her new school. The personal question in the middle of a work interaction caught Terry off guard, though she tried not to show it. She drew pictures of her classroom all evening. Apparently they have actual art supplies, not just broken crayons. The response came out before she could make it more formal, a glimpse of the exhausted relief she'd been carrying about her daughter finally having access to resources that should have been basic, but had felt like luxury. Something shifted in Jamie's expression, too quick to interpret, but present nonetheless. Kids shouldn't have to make do with broken things. The statement was simple but landed heavy, suggesting he understood more about their previous circumstances than the bare facts she'd provided in her application. He returned to his office before she could respond, leaving Terry to wonder again what exactly he'd seen that day she'd returned the wallet, what information he'd gathered about her life before deciding it was worth intervening in. The rest of the week established rhythms that felt sustainable, work that challenged her without overwhelming, colleagues who warmed to her competence once they realized she wasn't an incompetent charity case. She learned that Jamie's import business was genuinely successful, that the legitimate operations weren't just cover, but actual profitable enterprise. She also learned not to ask certain questions about shipments flagged with specific codes in the system. That discretion meant knowing what you weren't supposed to see. Friday afternoon, Patricia mentioned that Jamie wanted to see her before she left for the weekend. Terry's stomach clenched reflexively, old anxiety about being called to offices where decisions about her employment were made without her input. She knocked on his door at 4:55, finding him behind a desk that was somehow both organized and busy, papers arranged in ways that suggested active work rather than decorative professionalism. "You've done excellent work this week." Jamie's assessment was direct, no preamble or softening. Patricia says you've already identified inefficiencies in the customs documentation process that she's been trying to address for months. The compliment was specific enough to be genuine, acknowledging particular contribution rather than offering generic praise. Terry allowed herself to feel pride without letting it show too openly. The system needed someone looking at it with fresh perspective. She deflected slightly, uncomfortable with direct praise after so long being told she wasn't quite what companies were looking for. Jamie studied her with that same intensity from the train station, like he could see through professional courtesy to whatever she was actually feeling. The attention should have been invasive, but somehow wasn't, more like being recognized than examined. "Take this." He slid an envelope across the desk, similar to the one that had contained her contract, but thinner. "There's a store credit for the art supply shop 3 blocks from your apartment. For Bethany. Kids who like creating should have materials that don't limit their imagination." The gesture was thoughtful, but also dangerous territory. Personal gift that blurred lines she'd been careful to maintain between employer and whatever else Jamie might want to be. Terry's hand hovered over the envelope, temptation warring with the sense that accepting gifts outside her salary meant owing something she couldn't define. "That's generous, but I can buy her supplies now that I'm employed." The refusal was gentle but firm, protecting boundaries that felt important even if she couldn't articulate exactly why. Jamie's expression flickered with something that might have been respect, like her refusal confirmed something he'd been testing. December arrived with cold that transformed the city into something sharp and brittle, breath visible in the air and sidewalks treacherous with ice that maintenance crews couldn't quite keep ahead of. Terry walked Bethany to school each morning, the routine grounding after years of instability that made predictable schedules feel like unexpected luxury. Her daughter chattered about friends and art projects, excited descriptions of a world that was finally giving her space to be simply a child rather than someone learning to worry too young. The office had adopted holiday decorations that somehow managed to be festive without being excessive, strings of lights and a small tree in the lobby that smelled real. Terry coordinated the company party with efficiency that made Patricia joke about her having missed her calling as an event planner. The task was mindless enough to be relaxing, ordering catering and confirming vendor deliveries without the weight of decisions that actually mattered. She found herself humming while she worked, startled when she realized the sound was coming from her. Jamie had been traveling more frequently, trips to ports and supplier meetings that kept him away for days at a time. His absence somehow made the office feel less tense, people relaxing incrementally when they weren't being observed by someone who noticed everything. But Terry found she missed his presence in ways she didn't examine too closely. The way he'd stop by her desk with questions that were really just excuses to check how she was managing. The attention had started feeling less like surveillance, and more like someone ensuring she wasn't drowning. Late one evening, when she'd stayed to finish formatting a presentation for Jamie's morning meeting, she found him in the office kitchen making coffee with the concentration most people reserved for complex tasks. The break room was small, their proximity unavoidable in a way the open office layout usually prevented. "You don't need to stay this late," he said, without looking up, pouring water into the machine with careful measurement. "The presentation can wait until morning if it's not finished." "It's finished. I'm just doing final review to make sure the numbers align across all the slides." Terry poured herself coffee from the pot that was already made, the routine domestic enough to feel strange in this context. They were just 2 people taking a break from work, except one of them owned the company, and the other had been rescued from a train station bathroom crisis. The inequality was always present, but late evening with the office empty made it feel less pronounced. Jamie leaned against the counter, drinking his coffee black while studying her with that assessing look she'd started to recognize meant he was calculating whether to say something. "You're careful never to ask about the flagged shipments," he said finally, the statement not quite a question. Terry's hand tightened on her mug, awareness that this conversation could determine whether her employment continued or became complicated in ways she'd been avoiding thinking about. "I'm careful to do the job I was hired for without creating problems for myself or my daughter." Her response was honest, acknowledging without confirming that she'd noticed things that didn't quite add up in an otherwise legitimate operation. She met his eyes steadily, showing she wasn't naive but also wasn't interested in knowing more than necessary. The balance felt precarious, demonstrating intelligence without curiosity that could be perceived as threat. Something in Jamie's posture relaxed, satisfaction with her answer visible in the slight drop of his shoulders. "That's why you're still here," he said quietly. "Patricia is loyal, but she asks questions. The previous administrator was competent, but she gossiped. You do excellent work and understand that some information doesn't concern you. The explanation was the closest he'd come to acknowledging the dual nature of his business, the legitimate cover and the shadow operations underneath. Terry processed this carefully, understanding she was being offered a kind of trust that came with its own obligations. Knowing without asking meant complicity through silence, though what exactly she was silent about remained deliberately undefined. "I need this job," she said finally. "I need the stability and the security and the chance for Bethany to grow up without constantly moving. Whatever else is happening, I can't afford to be curious about it." "Understood." Jamie's single word carried weight of agreement and warning both. He pushed off the counter, rinsing his mug in the sink with automatic tidiness. "Your daughter left these in the lobby earlier." He pulled a small stack of drawings from his jacket pocket, colorful creations that Bethany must have been working on while waiting for Terry to finish work. The pictures showed the office building, stick figures that were clearly meant to be people, flowers that defied the winter happening outside. Terry took the drawings, throat tight with emotion she couldn't quite name. Bethany had drawn Jamie in several of them, a tall figure standing next to smaller ones representing Terry and herself. The child had labeled him Mr. "Jamie who helped us," the words printed carefully in her developing handwriting. The innocence of it contrasted sharply with the conversation they'd just had about willful ignorance and necessary silence. "She talks about you at dinner sometimes," Terry admitted, surprising herself with the sharing. "You're the man who makes sure we have everything we need. She doesn't understand that's what employers do. She thinks you're specially kind." The distinction mattered because Bethany's interpretation transformed business transaction into personal care, a narrative that was both true and dangerously incomplete. Jamie studied the drawing where Bethany had put the three of them together, something unreadable crossing his face. "Maybe she's not wrong," he said quietly. So soft Terry almost didn't hear it. Then he was moving toward his office, the moment broken, before it could develop into something that would require response. Terry stood in the break room holding her daughter's artwork, trying to understand what had just shifted between them. The weekend brought the first real snow, the kind that transformed the city into something beautiful before it became inconvenient. Terry and Bethany built a snowman in the small courtyard of their apartment building, their daughter's laughter bright against the muffled quiet that snow created. Other families emerged for the same purpose, kids throwing snowballs and parents drinking coffee from thermoses. Normal life happening all around them, the kind of normal Terry had thought might be permanently out of reach. Monday morning found flowers on her desk, a small arrangement in winter colors, with a card that said simply, "For making the chaos manageable, J.R." Patricia raised an eyebrow when she saw them but didn't comment, though her expression suggested she was revising her understanding of whatever dynamic existed between Terry and their employer. The flowers felt significant in ways that had nothing to do with their monetary value, acknowledgement that rippled through the office in glances and whispered speculation. Terry left them on her desk without comment, refusing to feed the gossip by either hiding or explaining them. She did her work with the same competence she'd brought since her first day, coordinating schedules and managing communications with efficiency that made her indispensable. If people wanted to speculate about her relationship with Jamie, she couldn't control that. But she could control her own behavior, maintaining professionalism that gave them nothing concrete to discuss. Jamie himself seemed unconcerned with office gossip, his interactions with Terry remaining professional with occasional glimpses of something warmer that she'd started to recognize as genuine care rather than obligation. He asked about Bethany's school play, remembered that Terry's birthday passed without fanfare, and arranged for the office to surprise her with cake. Small gestures that added up to attention that went beyond employer responsibility into territory that felt personal. The holiday party happened on a Friday evening, the office transformed with catering and music that made the space feel festive rather than corporate. Terry had dressed carefully, professional, but acknowledging this was celebration rather than standard workday. She'd helped Bethany with homework before Patricia's teenage daughter arrived to babysit. The arrangement another thoughtful detail that removed obstacles before Terry had to navigate them. Jamie found her near the food table, holding a glass of wine she'd been sipping slowly. "You clean up nice," he said. The compliment casual, but his eyes doing that assessment thing that made her aware of herself in ways she'd been avoiding. She'd worn a dress she'd found at a consignment shop, deep blue that flattered without being obvious. His approval registered as warmth that spread through her chest, dangerous pleasure in being noticed by someone whose attention she'd told herself was purely professional. The new year arrived with the kind of cold that made walking outside feel like a personal attack, wind cutting through layers of clothing with vindictive precision. Terry had settled into rhythms that felt sustainable, Mornings with Bethany that were peaceful rather than rushed, work that challenged without overwhelming, evenings where she could actually relax instead of calculating how to stretch resources through another week. The stability still felt fragile, like something that might dissolve if she acknowledged it too directly, but it was becoming harder to remember the constant anxiety that had defined her previous existence. Jamie had returned from a trip to the port cities looking tired in a way that had nothing to do with jet lag, tension in his shoulders that suggested complications in the parts of his business she deliberately didn't ask about. He'd been shorter with people all week, impatient with delays and errors that normally he'd handle with controlled calm. Terry had learned to read his moods through small signs, the way his jaw tightened when problems escalated beyond simple solutions, how his responses became clipped when stress mounted past his ability to compartmentalize it effectively. Thursday afternoon brought a visitor that changed the office atmosphere immediately, a man in an expensive suit whose presence made everyone suddenly very busy with tasks that kept them at their desks. He walked past reception without checking in, moving through the space with the entitlement of someone who didn't need permission. Terry watched him disappear into Jamie's office, the door closing with a firmness that suggested privacy was non-negotiable. Patricia appeared at Terry's desk moments later, her expression carefully neutral in a way that communicated warning. "Marcus Ventano," Patricia said quietly, the name delivered like it should mean something. "He and Jamie have business history that predates the import company. If he comes out and speaks to you, be polite but don't engage beyond basic courtesy." The instruction was clear, even though the reasoning remained deliberately vague. Terry nodded understanding, returning her attention to her computer screen while remaining hyper-aware of the closed door and whatever conversation was happening behind it. The voices that eventually emerged from Jamie's office were controlled but heated, the kind of argument that happened between people who knew each other well enough to dispense with pretense. Terry couldn't make out words, but the tone was unmistakable, disagreement that had history and weight behind it. Other employees had found reasons to be elsewhere, the open office area suddenly sparse with people who'd decided afternoon meetings or early departures were necessary. Only Terry remained at her desk, because leaving felt more conspicuous than staying. When the door opened, Marcus emerged first, his expression dark with anger that he was making minimal effort to conceal. His eyes swept the office and landed on Terry with an assessment that felt invasive, cataloging her presence and making calculations she didn't want to understand. "So this is the new one," he said, not to Terry, but to Jamie, who'd followed him out. The phrasing suggested she was one in a series, a replacement for previous people who'd occupied her role, and apparently left under circumstances that made Marcus skeptical. "Terry handles administrative coordination." Jamie's voice was flat, professional distance that drew clear lines around what Marcus was entitled to know. "She's not involved in anything beyond legitimate operations." The clarification was both protection and warning, establishing boundaries while acknowledging that Marcus knew enough about the business to require explicit statement about what she did and didn't have access to. Terry kept her eyes on her computer screen, typing nonsense into a document while appearing fully absorbed in work. Marcus laughed, the sound carrying no humor. They never are, until suddenly they're making phone calls to people who ask uncomfortable questions. He moved closer to Terry's desk, invading space in a way that felt deliberately threatening. "You seem smarter than the last one, though. Hopefully smart enough to understand that curiosity is expensive in ways your salary doesn't compensate for." The threat was casual, delivered with the confidence of someone accustomed to intimidating people into compliance. Jamie crossed the space between them faster than Terry would have thought possible for someone who normally moved with calculated deliberation, positioning himself between Marcus and her desk. "She's under my protection," he said quietly, the words somehow more threatening for their lack of volume. "Which means she's under the protection of everyone who values their ongoing business relationships with me. Make sure that's clearly understood by anyone who might be confused about it." The statement was directed at Marcus, but felt like it extended to larger networks of people Terry had no knowledge of. The tension stretched thin enough to snap, before Marcus stepped back, hands raised in mock surrender. "Always so territorial about your employees," he said, amusement cutting through the anger. "One of these days that's going to create complications you can't control." He left without further conversation, his departure somehow making the office feel larger, as if his presence had compressed the available space. Jamie remained standing, his back to Terry, while he visibly worked to control whatever emotion Marcus had triggered. Terry's hands had stopped their fake typing, frozen above the keyboard while her mind processed what had just happened. The interaction had revealed layers to Jamie's world that she'd successfully avoided thinking about. Confirmation that the shadow operations she pretended not to notice involved people who made threats in broad daylight. Protection sounded good, until you had to consider what you needed protection from. What kind of danger proximity did Jamie invited into her carefully rebuilt life? Take the rest of the day. Jamie's instruction came without him turning around, his voice still carrying the edge Marcus had put there. Patricia will call you a car. Take Bethany somewhere she likes. Do something normal. The directive was clearly meant to remove her from whatever aftermath was about to unfold, consideration that felt protective, but also underlined how thoroughly she was entangled in situations she didn't fully comprehend. Terry gathered her belongings with hands that wanted to shake, but refused to let them, maintaining composure while her mind raced through calculations about whether staying in this job was worth whatever had just been implicitly threatened. The car arrived within minutes, a town car with a driver who opened the door with professional courtesy that felt surreal after Marcus's casual menace. She texted the babysitter that she was coming early, trying to sound normal when nothing about the afternoon had been. Bethany was delighted with the unexpected early pickup, chattering about her day while Terry tried to focus on her daughter's joy, rather than replaying the office confrontation. They went to the art supply store, the one Jamie had tried to give her credit for months ago. Terry bought Bethany a set of quality-colored pencils and a sketch pad with thick paper, watching her daughter's face light up with pleasure that made the expense feel justified. Normal activities in normal places with normal concerns. Except Terry kept checking over her shoulder for threats she wouldn't recognize if they appeared. That evening, Jamie called her personal cell phone, a number she'd given him for emergencies, but that he'd never used before. "I need you to understand what happened today doesn't reflect on you or your position," he said without preamble, his voice tired in ways that made him sound older. "Marcus is angry about business decisions that have nothing to do with you. He was trying to get to me by making you uncomfortable, and I apologize for putting you in that situation." "Who is he?" Terry asked, the question emerging before caution could stop it. Silence stretched across the connection, Jamie clearly deciding how much truth to offer versus how much ignorance might protect her. She could hear him breathing, could picture him calculating the same risk-benefit analysis she'd watched him perform in countless business decisions. The pause extended long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "He's someone I used to work with more closely before I started building legitimate operations," Jamie finally said, choosing words with visible care. "He thinks I've gone soft, that prioritizing legal business over the other activities is weakness that will eventually cost me. Today was him testing whether my protection of you was serious or just posturing." The explanation offered more truth than she'd expected. Acknowledgement of the dual nature of his empire without providing details that could implicate her. Terry processed this while watching Bethany color at the kitchen table, her daughter's simple joy in new art supplies throwing sharp relief on the complicated reality of how they'd achieved this stability. Should I be worried? The question was direct, requiring honesty that Jamie could avoid with platitudes about everything being fine. She needed to know whether keeping this job meant accepting risk that could affect Bethany, whether the price of stability included dangers she hadn't factored into her calculations. "No one will touch you," Jamie said, certainty absolute in his tone. "I've made that clear to everyone who matters. But I can't guarantee you won't see things occasionally that remind you the legitimate business isn't the only one I run. If that's something you can't live with, I'll understand. I'll give you 3 months severance and excellent references. No questions asked." The offer was genuine, an exit ramp provided before the road got more dangerous. Terry looked at their apartment, at Bethany's drawings covering the refrigerator, at the stability they'd built in 4 months that had felt impossible 6 months ago. "I don't want to leave," she said quietly, making a choice that felt both necessary and potentially reckless. "I just need to know the boundaries, what I should do if something like today happens again." The statement was acceptance with conditions, acknowledgement that she was choosing to stay, despite understanding more clearly what that meant. February brought the kind of gray weather that made the city feel perpetually damp, rain that wasn't quite snow, and cold that seeped into bones despite layers of clothing. Bethany had started talking about Valentine's Day with the enthusiasm children brought to holidays that involved candy and craft projects, her teacher apparently planning classroom celebrations that required parent participation. Terry had volunteered to bring supplies, grateful that contributing now meant buying items instead of explaining why she couldn't afford to help. The office had returned to normal rhythms after Marcus's visit, though Terry noticed increased security measures that appeared without announcement or explanation. New cameras in the parking garage, a second security guard at the lobby desk during evening hours, badge readers installed on doors that previously had been freely accessible. The changes happened quietly but systematically, evidence that Jamie's protection wasn't just words, but concrete action that involved expense and planning. Patricia mentioned during their Friday coffee routine that Terry had been with the company for 5 months, which apparently qualified her for benefits expansion that included increased vacation time and retirement, matching that kicked in at higher percentages. "He takes care of people who prove themselves trustworthy," Patricia said. The statement clearly meant to communicate that Terry had passed whatever extended evaluation period had been operating since her hire. The promotion felt like validation, but also like deeper entanglement in an organization whose full scope remained deliberately obscured. Jamie had been traveling less frequently, but working longer hours, often still in his office when Terry left for the evening. She'd started making extra coffee before she departed, leaving it in an insulated carafe on his desk with a note about the presentation files he'd requested or the schedule changes she'd coordinated. The small gestures felt domestic in ways that probably crossed professional boundaries, but he never commented on them except through the occasional thank you text that arrived well after midnight. Bethany's bedtime routine had expanded to include increasingly elaborate stories about her day, detailed accounts of friend dramas and art projects, and the rabbit they were raising in the classroom as a science project. Terry listened with the attention that felt like privilege after so long being too exhausted and anxious to be fully present for her daughter's childhood. These evening conversations revealed a child who was thriving, who'd stopped asking questions about whether they'd have to move again, or whether there was enough money for school supplies. One evening in mid-February, Bethany emerged from her room with a piece of paper carefully folded and decorated with hearts drawn in red crayon. "We're supposed to write letters for Valentine's Day," she explained, climbing into Terry's lap with the solid weight of a child who felt secure enough to still seek physical comfort. "I wrote mine to the universe, like how we used to do when we didn't have anyone specific to write to. Is that okay?" Terry's throat tightened at the memory of earlier, harder times when they'd written wishes to nobody in particular, because hope needed somewhere to go even without clear destination. "That's perfect, baby. What did you wish for?" She smoothed Bethany's hair, breathing in the scent of child shampoo and the lingering smell of crayons that seemed permanently embedded in her daughter's clothes, now that art supplies were abundant rather than rationed. "I wished for us to stay here forever," Bethany said simply, her child's understanding of forever meaning stability, rather than literal eternity. "And I wished that Mr. Jamie could be part of our family for real, not just because he's Mommy's boss. He seems lonely sometimes when he thinks nobody's watching him." The observation was delivered with the clarity children brought to emotional truths that adults learn to ignore, insight that made Terry realize her daughter saw more than she'd credited. The letter remained on the kitchen counter where Bethany left it, folded into a shape that was attempting to be an envelope, but mostly just looked like a rectangle with extra creases. Terry found herself reading it after Bethany had gone to bed, the careful printing revealing wishes that were both heartbreaking and hopeful. "Dear Universe, thank you for our new home and for Mommy being happy again. Please let us stay here, and please help Mr. Jamie not be sad. Love, Bethany." The simplicity of it cut deeper than elaborate prose could have. Terry tucked the letter back where Bethany had left it, then found herself crying in the kitchen for reasons she couldn't fully articulate. Relief that her daughter felt secure enough to think about other people's happiness. Guilt that achieving stability had required accepting help from someone whose business involved enough danger that men like Marcus made threats in offices. Fear that Bethany's attachment to Jamie would become another complication in a situation already too complicated to navigate cleanly. The emotions tangled together until she couldn't separate one from another. Monday brought a software crisis that required Terry to stay late coordinating with IT support across 3 time zones, the kind of problem that was nobody's fault, but everyone's responsibility to fix. By the time systems were restored and she'd verified that no data had been lost, the office had emptied except for Jamie's light still visible under his door. She knocked softly before entering, finding him behind his desk with the exhausted focus of someone who'd been staring at screens too long. "We're back online," she reported, setting a status report on his desk. "No data loss, all backups verified. Systems should be stable through the morning." The technical details were what he needed to know, facts that let him move forward with whatever decisions depended on operational capacity. He nodded thanks, but didn't look up, attention still fixed on whatever document consumed his focus. Terry turned to leave, then made a decision that felt risky, but necessary. "Bethany wrote you a Valentine," she said, the statement stopping him mid-sentence in whatever he was reading. She doesn't know I'm telling you, and I'm not giving it to you because it's addressed to the universe, not to a person. But I thought you should know that a 6-year-old thinks you're lonely and wants you to be happy. The information was offered without expectation of response, just truth that felt important to share even if it created awkwardness. Jamie's expression did something complicated, emotions crossing his face too quickly to catalog before settling into something that looked like surprised vulnerability. "I am lonely," he said quietly, the admission seeming to surprise him as much as it surprised Terry. "I built all of this, the legitimate business and the other operations, thinking power and control would be enough. Then you and Bethany showed up in a train station and somehow a 6-year-old sees through everything I've carefully constructed." The honesty hung between them, more intimate than anything physical could have been because it was truth without armor. Terry found herself moving closer to his desk, drawn by the same instinct that had made her return a wallet when she desperately needed the money inside. "She also wished we could stay here forever," Terry offered, giving him Bethany's other wish, because it felt like information he deserved. "Which I think means she feels safe for the first time in a long time. That's because of you." "It's because of you," Jamie corrected, standing and moving around the desk to lean against it, closer to where Terry stood. "You're the one who chose dignity over desperation, who makes her feel secure, who turned this job into stability instead of just another temporary situation. I just opened a door. You walked through it and built something worth keeping." The compliment was specific, acknowledging her agency in their changed circumstances rather than positioning himself as sole architect of their rescue. The admission settled between them with a weight that felt permanent, acknowledgement that what they'd built together exceeded the transactional nature of employer and employee. Terry found herself studying his face in the low office lighting, noticing details she'd deliberately avoided cataloging before because seeing them felt like admitting something she wasn't ready to name. The slight scar above his left eyebrow that suggested a past more violent than import businesses typically required, the way his jaw tightened when he was working through complicated decisions, how his eyes softened specifically when Bethany was mentioned in ways they never did during business discussions. These observations had accumulated over months of proximity, filed away in the part of her mind that recognized danger in getting too close to someone whose world operated by rules she didn't fully understand. Jamie seemed to be conducting his own assessment, his gaze tracking across her features with the same intensity he brought to contract negotiations and shipping manifests. She wondered what he saw when he looked at her now, versus that first day in the train station when she'd been composed, desperation held together by maternal determination and the last threads of dignity. The woman standing in his office bore little physical resemblance to that version of herself, better clothes and regular meals having restored what months of poverty had stripped away. But Terry suspected the changes he was cataloging went deeper than surface improvements. She'd stopped flinching at unexpected expenses, stopped calculating every purchase against survival mathematics, stopped carrying the permanent tension of someone waiting for the next catastrophe. The transformation was visible in ways that had nothing to do with her wardrobe. "Bethany asked me last week if you were going to be her new daddy," Terry said quietly, the confession emerging without planning, because the evening had already crossed so many boundaries that one more felt inevitable. "I told her that adults had complicated relationships that didn't follow the same rules as families in her storybooks. She looked at me like I was being deliberately difficult and said that you already acted like a daddy, so why couldn't you just be one officially?" The child's logic was simultaneously naive and devastatingly accurate, cutting through the complicated calculations adults employed to protect themselves from vulnerability. Jamie's expression transformed through several emotions too quickly to catalog individually, landing somewhere between longing and fear that suggested Bethany's question had touched something he'd been avoiding examining too closely. The space between them felt charged with possibility that had been building for months, through coffee left on desks and flowers given without occasion and protection, offered against men who made threats. Terry knew crossing the professional distance would complicate everything, knew that mixing gratitude with attraction was dangerous territory, but Bethany's wish about family echoed in her mind, and the loneliness in Jamie's admission matched something in her own, carefully guarded heart. "This is a bad idea," she said quietly, even as she didn't step back. Jamie's mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile, acknowledgement that she was probably right. "Terrible idea," he agreed, his voice dropping lower. "You work for me. You depend on me for your stability. Power dynamics are completely inappropriate." The cataloging of reasons this shouldn't happen was thorough, professional distance reasserting itself through verbal acknowledgement of all the problems. But neither of them moved away, the space between them holding tension that felt inevitable, despite all the logical reasons to maintain boundaries. The office was empty, the city dark beyond the windows, and for once the complications of their situation felt less important than the simple fact that two lonely people had found something unexpected in each other. Terry's breath caught when Jamie's hand lifted toward her face, pausing before contact like seeking permission. The knock on the office door shattered the moment with the efficiency of cold water, both of them stepping back as security guard appeared with the end-of-night building check. "Just making sure you're locked up when you leave, Mr. Russo," the guard said, pretending not to notice the tension he'd interrupted. Jamie nodded acknowledgement, professional mask sliding back into place with practiced ease. Terry gathered her belongings with hands that weren't quite steady, the almost moment hanging between them like unfinished sentence. March arrived with the kind of weather that couldn't decide what season it belonged to, days that alternated between winter's last gasps and spring's tentative promises. Terry had been with the company for 6 months, a milestone that felt significant in ways that had nothing to do with employment benefits or probation periods ending. 6 months ago, she'd been crying in a train station bathroom with no way home, and now she was coordinating international shipping schedules and paying rent without panic attacks. The transformation felt both monumental and quietly ordinary, like miracles that happened so gradually they stopped seeming impossible. Jamie had been different since the evening they'd almost crossed lines they couldn't uncross, careful about proximity in ways that somehow made the awareness between them more pronounced. He still left thank you notes when she made coffee, still asked about Bethany with genuine interest, but there was new weight to the interactions that hadn't existed before. They were dancing around something neither of them had language for, professional colleagues who'd become something more without clear definition of what that more actually meant. The company secured a new contract with suppliers in Southeast Asia, expansion that required hiring additional staff and restructuring departments to handle increased volume. Patricia suggested Terry for a promotion to operations manager, position that came with salary increase and office with a door that closed. The opportunity was legitimate merit-based advancement, but Terry couldn't help wondering if Jamie had influenced the decision. When she asked Patricia directly, the older woman had just smiled and said that competence spoke for itself, regardless of who was paying attention. Bethany's school scheduled parent-teacher conferences on a Wednesday afternoon, requiring Terry to leave work early for the first time since starting her position. She'd mentioned it to Jamie in passing during their morning schedule review, not requesting permission, but informing him of the absence. He'd nodded acknowledgement, then surprised her an hour later by asking if she'd mind if he attended the conference with her. As a friend who's interested in her progress, he clarified, giving her space to refuse without awkwardness. The question should have felt like overstepping, inappropriate blurring of boundaries between employer and employee, but Terry found herself agreeing before fully processing the implications. Bethany had been asking when she could show Mr. Jamie her artwork displayed in the school hallway, when he might have time to see the rabbit their class was raising. The child had no framework for understanding complicated adult relationships, only knew that Jamie was someone important, who made her mother smile more than she had in the difficult years before they'd moved. They drove to the school separately, but arrived within minutes of each other, meeting in the parking lot where other parents were gathering for their scheduled appointments. Jamie looked different outside the office context, somehow more approachable in jeans and a casual jacket than he ever did in expensive suits. Teachers and other parents noticed him with the instinctive recognition people gave to confidence and controlled power, curiosity in their glances about his relationship to Terry and Bethany. The conference itself was glowing, Bethany's teacher showing portfolio of artwork and reporting academic progress that suggested a child who was thriving intellectually and socially. "She's come so far since the beginning of the year," the teacher said, directing her comments to both Terry and Jamie like they were a unit. "The anxiety that was visible in her early work has completely disappeared. Whatever changes happened in your family situation have made a tremendous positive impact." The assessment was professional, but the implication was clear. Assumption that they were together creating stable home environment. Neither Terry nor Jamie corrected the assumption, some unspoken agreement passing between them. That explanation was more complicated than letting the misunderstanding stand. They toured the classroom afterward, Bethany appearing from wherever students waited during conferences to proudly show Jamie her displayed paintings. She held his hand with the unself-conscious affection of a child who'd decided someone was safe, chattering about techniques her teacher had shown her and which colors worked best for different subjects. The image of them together, Bethany's small hand in Jamie's larger one, while she explained her artistic process with earnest enthusiasm, created an ache in Terry's chest that was equal parts hope and fear. This was what family looked like from the outside, the casual intimacy of people who belonged to each other. But their situation was built on foundations that included returned wallets and train station desperation, and shadow businesses that involved men making threats. How did something that looked this right emerge from circumstances that had been so thoroughly wrong? After they left the school, Jamie suggested dinner at a family restaurant near Terry's apartment, the kind of place with crayons on tables and a children's menu that came with activity pages. Bethany accepted the invitation with delight that made refusal impossible, though Terry felt the evening shifting from professional courtesy into something that resembled actual date. They sat in a booth with Bethany between them, the child coloring while they waited for food and maintained conversation that carefully avoided work topics. "Do you think about that day in the train station?" Jamie asked after Bethany had been distracted by ice cream, the question quiet enough that only Terry could hear. She did think about it, more often than was probably healthy, the memory of desperate fear and his unexpected intervention that had somehow transformed into this life they were building. "Every day," she admitted, matching his quiet tone. "I think about how close we came to something much worse, how easily things could have gone differently." Jamie's hand was on the table between them, close enough that moving her fingers an inch would mean contact. She didn't move them, but didn't pull back either, existing in the space of almost touching that had characterized their relationship for months. "I think about it too," he said, eyes on Bethany, who was focused entirely on chocolate ice cream with sprinkles. "I think about walking past you, making the phone call more important than a child asking for help. How different everything would be if I'd made that choice." "Why didn't you?" Terry asked, the question one she'd wanted to voice since that first day but had never felt entitled to. Jamie was quiet for a long moment, watching Bethany with an expression that was complicated in ways Terry was beginning to understand. "Because I've spent years building walls," he finally said. "Power and control and careful distance from anything that might make me vulnerable. Then a 6-year-old looked at me like I was someone who helped people instead of someone who frightened them. And I wanted to be that person, even if just for a moment." The confession was the most honest thing he'd said since admitting he was lonely. Vulnerability that matched the night they'd almost kissed in his office. Terry's hand moved that final inch, fingertips brushing his palm in contact. That was brief, but deliberate. "You are that person," she said quietly. "The helping isn't pretense. It's just a side of yourself you don't show most people." Bethany saw it immediately because children are better at recognizing truth than adults are. Bethany finished her ice cream and announced she needed to use the bathroom, forcing Terry to break the moment and accompany her daughter. When they returned, Jamie had paid the check and was standing ready to leave, the spell of intimacy broken by the practical requirements of parenting and public spaces. They walked to their cars in the cooling evening, Bethany holding both their hands and swinging between them with the joy of a child who felt secure in her place between two adults who cared for her. "Thank you for coming tonight," Terry said when they reached her car. Bethany already buckled in her booster seat and fighting to keep her eyes open. Jamie stood close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his eyes, details she'd noticed in his office but felt more significant in the casual intimacy of a restaurant parking lot. "Thank you for letting me," he responded, the simple statement carrying weight of gratitude for inclusion in moments that weren't his by right, but had been offered as gift. The drive home was short, Bethany falling asleep before they'd traveled 3 blocks. Terry carried her daughter inside and tucked her into bed without fully waking her, the routine precious in its mundane domesticity. She returned to the living room and found herself drawn to the window, looking out at the city that had become home in ways their previous places never had. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jamie, simple message that said, "Tonight felt like family. Thank you for that." Terry typed and deleted several responses before settling on equally simple truth. "It did. That scares me and makes me happy in equal measure." His response came immediately, just a single word: "Same." She smiled at her phone like a teenager instead of a single mother navigating complicated feelings about her employer who'd rescued her from a bathroom crisis and somehow become essential to her daughter's happiness and her own carefully guarded heart. The following weeks brought a subtle shift in their interactions, boundaries remaining professional at work, but something acknowledged between them, now that hadn't been explicitly named before. They were building towards something neither of them fully understood yet, family forming not through traditional structures, but through choice and consistency, and shared investment in a child's well-being. Jamie started appearing more regularly for school events, helping with homework at Terry's apartment while she cooked dinner, reading bedtime stories when he stayed late enough that Bethany caught him before sleep. One Saturday in early April, Jamie suggested an outing to the art museum, space he thought Bethany would enjoy given her obvious talent and enthusiasm for creating. They spent hours wandering galleries, Bethany asking endless questions about techniques and colors, while Jamie demonstrated surprising knowledge about artistic movements and historical context. Terry watched them discuss a Monet with serious concentration, her daughter and this man who'd become essential to their lives, and felt something shift in her chest toward recognition of what was actually happening. The museum cafe where they stopped for lunch occupied a glass-walled space overlooking a sculpture garden, spring finally asserting itself through green shoots and early blooms that transformed winter's barrenness into promise. Bethany had insisted on sitting between them again, a positioning choice she made consistently now, as if physically placing herself at the center of their relationship would somehow make it more permanent. She was sketching in a small notebook Jamie had bought her at the museum gift shop, replicating from memory a painting they'd seen earlier with a concentration that made her tongue stick out slightly in focus. The image she was creating bore little technical resemblance to the original, but captured its emotional essence with the instinctive understanding children brought to art before formal training taught them limitation. Jamie watched Bethany draw with an expression Terry had learned to recognize as him processing emotions he didn't have vocabulary for, the careful control that governed his business dealings dissolving into something more vulnerable when confronted with a child's unselfconscious affection. He'd told Terry once during a late evening conversation that he'd never planned for family, that his world had seemed too complicated and dangerous to invite innocence into it, but that calculus had shifted so gradually he hadn't noticed until Bethany had wrapped herself around his life with the tenacity of someone who'd decided he was hers to keep. The admission had been offered without expectation of response, just truth shared in the darkness of an office after everyone else had gone home. But Terry had filed it away as evidence that whatever was happening between them wasn't one-sided attraction, but mutual recognition of something worth protecting. The afternoon stretched into evening without any of them suggesting they should leave, the museum becoming a bubble removed from the complicated realities of their constructed family. Terry found herself laughing at Jamie's deliberately terrible attempts to explain abstract expressionism to Bethany, watching him gesture dramatically at paintings while making up increasingly ridiculous interpretations that had her daughter giggling. This version of him bore no resemblance to the controlled businessman who conducted meetings with intimidating efficiency or the man who'd faced down Marcus with quiet threat. He was simply someone trying to make a child laugh, succeeding through willing self-deprecation that revealed comfort with himself Terry envied. The evening felt like a gift, ordinary family time that was extraordinary precisely because they'd built it from circumstances that should have resulted in nothing more than brief train station encounter. They were becoming a family in all the ways that mattered, constructed not from obligation or traditional timelines, but from deliberate choice and consistent presence. Jamie had never promised forever, never made declarations about relationships or futures, but he showed up, repeatedly and reliably, choosing them when he could have chosen the easier path of distance. The love growing between them was quiet and complicated, built on foundation of returned wallets and train station interventions, and protection offered against dangerous men. That evening, after Bethany had fallen asleep between them on the couch during a movie, Jamie carried her to bed with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it before. He returned to find Terry still on the couch, comfortable in his presence in ways she'd stopped questioning. "I need to tell you something," he said, sitting down with the careful posture of someone preparing for difficult conversation. Terry's stomach clenched reflexively, old anxiety about good things ending resurfacing, despite months of stability. "I'm getting out," Jamie said quietly, the statement requiring no clarification about what exactly he was leaving. "The legitimate business is profitable enough to sustain itself, and I've spent 6 months systematically extracting myself from the other operations. Marcus and others aren't happy about it, but I've made arrangements that satisfy obligations without ongoing involvement." He paused, meeting her eyes with intensity that demanded honest reaction. "I'm doing this for myself, not for you or Bethany. But I need you to know that the complications you've been worried about are ending." Terry processed this carefully, understanding that the decision represented monumental shift in Jamie's life that preceded whatever was developing between them. "When?" she asked, needing timeline to anchor the information. "Final transitions happen over the next month," he explained. "By summer, Russo Import will be exclusively legitimate operations. I'll probably make less money, definitely have fewer connections to people who operate outside legal boundaries, but I'll also sleep better and won't have to worry about 6-year-olds getting caught in crossfire of my previous choices. The admission was gift and revelation both. Acknowledgement that Bethany's presence in his life had catalyzed change he'd been considering, but hadn't committed to until a child looked at him like he was someone who helped people instead of someone who frightened them. Terry felt tears building behind her eyes, emotion that was relief and gratitude, and something deeper that she wasn't ready to name yet. "That must be terrifying," she said, honoring the magnitude of what he was giving up. "It is," Jamie agreed, reaching for her hand with deliberation that made the gesture significant, but less terrifying than the alternative. "I watched you choose dignity over desperation in a train station, return money you desperately needed because it was the right thing. You made me want to be the person who deserved someone like you in his life. Bethany made me want to be someone who could show up without bringing danger. This is me trying to become that person, not just pretend to be him." Terry let herself cry then, quiet tears that were release of tension she'd been carrying since Marcus had made threats in her office. Jamie pulled her against him, solid presence that had become safety in ways she'd stopped believing were possible. They sat like that for a long time, two people who'd found each other in a train station bathroom crisis, and had somehow built something worth protecting from the complications of the past. The future was uncertain, full of questions about what they were to each other and how to build family from unconventional foundations. But for the first time since her daughter had said, "Sir, my mommy's crying in the bathroom," Terry let herself believe that everything might actually work out. Thank you all for following this story. If you're enjoying it, write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support means everything and helps me continue creating these stories. Let me know if Terry, Jamie, and Bethany's journey touched your heart and what other stories you'd like to see next.